Disrupting the pattern that sustains racism. This is my final assessment for Ethnic Studies 101. I'm going to be answering the question: what kind of social justice is needed to heal the wounds of racial racism in the United States? This is my outline. Why the USA's history created an environment for racism to thrive, how racial wounds are interconnected, a term known as intersectionality, specific examples of racial wounds in the United States, a structure by Eric Yamamoto on how to heal wounds, and my plan for addressing a singular wound. So, what is social justice? A society devoid of oppression. Racial justice is a society devoid of racial oppression. So, look at this picture. I want you to focus on the big picture, the signing of documents by founding fathers. If you look around the room, you notice that there's not much diversity. Um, you know, the start of this nation, the writing of the laws, it was all written by a certain selective group. It's all written to benefit that group. Um, these laws that were written, they're in a very narrow scope. You know, they're meant to benefit white men, white older men, and it's a pattern that's constantly seen throughout history. Oppression is someone stands against something. Intersectionality. So it's a term used by sociologists to kind of describe how an environment is created for racism to thrive, and it's made up of three interlocking systems of oppression: capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. In each of these systems, someone is winning something, someone is therefore put down. Someone is gaining something, I should say. And it's important to understand that we cannot understand one system of oppression without looking at the others. I want to talk about two philosophers, natural rights, John Locke and Thomas Jefferson: life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. And each of these different natural rights, were infringed upon for people of color throughout the history of the United States. Because of time, I'm only going to be able to go over a few examples. So let's look at life. People of color and poor people are likely to live in places that can directly damage their health. Toxic waste dumps, highly polluted freeways, and other environmental hazards. It was evident in 1970 at Hyde Park, which is a community of non-whites in living in terrible sewage conditions, and these conditions were nothing was done by the government. They were almost neglected, left to fend on their own. Look at these charts. As you notice, whites are always at the bottom of the list in prevalence of diabetes, early preterm births, death from homicide, and it's not a coincidence. Liberty. There's several examples of wounds caused from beginning to the end of the criminal justice system in the United States. There is discrimination for non-whites, racial profiling. How people of color are seen as suspicious, harmful people, and that affects how they get arrested, and then so forth. Throughout the system. When it comes to sentencing, Black and Latinos are more likely to be sentenced to longer prison terms than whites. Not only that, when a criminal has finished serving their term, supposedly pay their debt to society, they still are not exactly considered citizens. They have some voting restrictions put on them, which takes away a lot of their say as a citizen in the United States, a lot of their power, a lot of their freedom. I wanted to mention that it's not specific to men. Black women are 3 times as likely as white women to be incarcerated, and Latinas are twice as likely. Let's look at property. A combination of three forces led to residential segregation: collective racial violence carried out by whites, practices created and reinforced by emerging real estate industry, and federal housing programs that were made available almost exclusively to whites. Another example is subprime loans, which were dangerous, risky loans that were given to people of color. In 2019, over 15% of subprime loans were in foreclosure. That only affects where they live, but also their community. It's pursuit of happiness, specific to work life. There's an obvious wage gap, between men and women. Not only that, wage gap between men of color, uh, women of color, and then white men and women. Um, Not only that, but there's from the beginning process, of the hiring process, there's entrenched stereotypes and implicit biases that um, managers have, and these managers usually tend to be white. So these things that they may not even be overtly racist, but they have these stereotypes, and because of that, it affects how the hiring process goes for people of color. Pursuit of happiness. Look at education. An individual's opportunities for financial stability increasingly depend on completing college. Education is very, very important. It's supposed to be an equalizer. It's supposed to have everyone start off, or move forward in their life, at the same opportunities. But as we've seen throughout history, people of color and whites have not started on the same, have not been given the same opportunities. Eric Yamamoto's four steps to social justice. So the first one is recognition. The second one is responsibility. Third one, reconstruction, and fourth, reparations. Recognition is the first step. We have to recognize the harms created by racism. Look at intersectionality. It's not just, it's usually not just one harm isolated. These harms tend to bleed into one into the other. Responsibility. After the recognition is there, the person who's responsible has to take that responsibility, has to identify themselves. After they identify themselves, they can start to reconstruct the relationship between human and human. A good example of what it takes is an apology. After that is done, they can move on to reparations, and a program of reparations has three main objectives: acknowledgement of past injustices, redress for injustice, and closure. Let's look at the example I'm zoning in on, the property wound. So the example from 1930s to 1960s, the guidelines of the NAR real estate boards prevented realtors from selling homes to non-whites in white areas. So it's the policies that they had. To recognize this, you have to realize that it's not just about not letting people of color live in white areas. It goes further than that. People in these areas tend to live healthier lives. They have access to better produce, access to better things around them. They have better education and tend to have less crime rates. So it's easy to blame the association or responsibility. It's easy to blame the association, but it's also the families that benefited from non-whites being ostracized. The third stage is reconstruction, so saying I'm sorry. It might be difficult to get everyone involved to acknowledge their role in this harm. A great start would be, the head of the association to set an example and to publicly apologize. And then if that is done, the practical side of this is very difficult to achieve. But again, you have to remember it starts with the first step, recognition. So it would be almost impossible to calculate what is owed for justice. But they could possibly work on a fresh start, which it would be to raise money to assist people of color in buying real estate.